Growing nut trees for nuts. Oh my gosh, this is my favorite. This is what I don't know if you noticed, but I've been writing on all those like comments. I want fruit, information about fruit.
Well, I'm gonna say this again in a second, but you know, our speaker today is Dr. Lockwood. And
Yes.
we wanted him in person, but he broke his ankle and ended up having surgery.
Oh, no.
So we found a lecture that he did that I think covers everything that he would have talked about anyway.
Yeah.
So he's about to retire. And I love him. I think he's one of the most knowledgeable professors I've encountered in all my time dealing with, you know, the extension programs. I'm sure they're all very knowledgeable, but he's just very practical and laid back. He gets your question. And so if we have questions today that we can't answer, we'll get them to him and get back to you guys. So, how are you? You were smart, you got something to eat.
Well, it says lunch.
It is,
No,
it
we
is.
tried. The place we went to was closed. Are you kidding me? Seriously, on a Saturday? Which one was closed? That little coffee with cafe. I thought they were open on Saturdays. We're gonna
They
usually
usually
share.
are, almost every lunch.
I know. I
There's
was
so many
like,
luncheon places and they're all closed, like they have breakfast and lunch during the week.
yeah.
But not on Saturday?
Saturdays, finding a place for dinner is like impossible.
I know. We moved up from Florida, so that's the one thing we can honestly complain about living up here.
Yeah.
Food choices and the fact that half the time they're closed. We're like,
Right.
Well, I think part of that is the pandemic.
I'm
I
like,
think
how
the
do you make
pandemic
money
is,
We moved from Oklahoma and it's worse here
Yeah.
than it was there. There was more there than there was here.
Well, there's lots of business opportunities for anybody who wants to go in the restaurant business.
Oh, we tried that and think, oh, we didn't, thought we got to right before COVID hit in Kingston.
Yeah.
Because I cook, so.
Yeah.
Yeah, other places like closed, I mean, any breakfast place, you can find them on the weekdays and do Monday to Friday and that's it. And then they close at 2.
They're still having problems finding people that even want to work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. They opened that nice little cafe in Rockwood and it was doing great, but no, it was across the street from Mimi's. Mimi's is good. They're a mainstay in Rockwood.
Yeah. And
But,
they're open in the weekends too, I think.
They're not open on Sundays.
There's a Cadillac Garage.
Yeah, Cadillac Grill is a, evening place. Yeah.
I don't like that place very much.
Oh, yeah.
But you're talking about a cafe.
Well, it was next to Cadillac Grill.
Yeah, I saw that.
And it was doing great. He was losing money hand over fist because I guess the lunch business in Rockwood is not that brisk.
So did he go out of business? 'Cause I don't see anything.
Well, he owns Cadillac Grill too.
He also owned
Yeah.
Jake's,
He used to own Jake's, yeah.
and Jake's was pretty good.
Well,
Not most recently, he hasn't owned Jake's in 10 years.
Oh.
Um,
Somebody else owned
Because
Jake's,
Jake's
Yeah.
just recently went out of business.
but they went out of business.
Jake's went out of business
Yeah,
too?
Jake's is done.
Couple
Jake's
months
done.
ago.
Oh, that's too bad.
But there's a new place in Rockwood that's supposed to be open, something tavern.
Yeah, Diamond Tap Tavern.
Is that good?
So
Is that
I've
supposed to
I've
be
not,
open?
I've been one time and they were so new that they were still getting acclimated.
What is good is there's a place next to Food City.
Yes, the little bistro, Maple Street.
Oh,
Bistro.
yeah.
That is really good.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Everything that's been in there has been
Really
good.
nice inside.
it's Monkey Town Brewery, same people, same owners, from what I understand.
Maybe, no, the previous owners was Monkey Town and they have been operating Uchi Marina and they do a good job there.
Yeah, we like the wings there.
Yeah, but they're closed for the season.
I know, we go there by boat all the time, but yeah.
I
Yeah.
found good Chinese.
Yeah, that's what I eat when I go out of town is I don't have a local Chinese place that I love.
We go to we were in Rockwood, so we go to what's the name of that Chinese?
New
New China.
New China, yeah,
Is that
Yeah,
good?
we get takeout. It's really good. We never eat there.
yeah.
There's a buffet too.
They have a buffet, we just buy it.
No, that's interesting.
Yeah.
I didn't know if that was. right.
And you could do takeout from the buffet?
That's all we
Yeah,
do is
they just
takeout.
weigh it.
But
Huh.
there's plenty of people eating there. I mean, sitting
Yeah.
down and eating there.
I have eaten there, but it was a long time ago. I haven't been there in a while.
Oh, well, we like, El Patron.
I love El Patron.
Yeah, they used to be kind of bad about 6 years ago when we first moved here, but they really improved
Yeah.
and the quality's pretty good.
If you have any
That's on
problems,
Main Highway, is that the right
Yeah, off
way?
of 27.
Yeah.
it's in an old bank building.
Oh,
Yeah.
Yeah, so you can sit in the vault.
And we sit outside,
Yeah.
or in the vault.
Yeah, but your cell phone doesn't work that great in the vault if you need to.
Yeah,
They try to unplug.
Yeah.
Like, we're supposed to get next generation, so that's the one I'm like.
Yeah.
There's no shortage of Mexican in this area.
Yeah, oh yeah, there's good.
We need more, I'd love to have a Thai
Yeah.
restaurant. and-
what was wrong with those?
We drive all the way to Nashville to get Thai. food.
Yeah, Thai food is, Mm-mm-mm.
That's where we're going for dinner tonight.
yeah. I have a neighbor that she went to Thailand and did a cooking class when she was there, and she's had us over to cook Thai.
Oh,
So-
The bank,
I tried curry, I didn't do too bad.
Next to
cooking
Orion.
curry
Yeah.
the first time, 'cause I've never made Thai.
right by the highway.
That's like,
Yeah,
I was
just
going
on the
on
highway.
Yeah, I can't think of the name.
I'm like, there was something to make this all the time. I'm
Right,
gonna go
right,
to Thai
exactly.
restaurant.
Exactly.
Once or
So I was palm sugar in my fridge.
So-
and I'm like,
Yeah, I just, I don't want to get it all. I mean,
And fish
can't
sauce.
remember where. And in
So-
Motor City, there's a buffet down there too, and I kind of like that Chinese.
Yeah.
Oh, mhm. That's too far for us.
This would be really, well, me too.
Yeah.
This would be closer with me. So I don't know.
That-
You guys ready to roll?
Yeah.
All right. So have you guys all been here before? I seem to recognize, you guys haven't been here before? Oh, okay. So welcome, welcome. This is the Lunch and Learn program that's hosted by the Master Gardeners, and it's every month on the second Saturday at noon. And we try to do a variety of topics, and we try to make it as practical for you all as possible. So we typically have a survey that we ask you to put topics on, which unfortunately we don't have today. We've had a couple emergency things happen, so all our people aren't here. But if you have a suggestion for a program, if you'll write it on the sign-in sheet, we'll add it to the list. And we're in the process of planning next year's programs. So, we'd love to do the things that are most interesting to people. And so today we're going to do, fruit and nut trees is our topic. And our speaker is Dr. Lockwood, who is the premier expert in this area, not only in Tennessee, but Georgia as well. And I think part of South Carolina, he has covered that area for 30 years. And unfortunately, he broke his ankle and had to have surgery. So he's not here in person as we originally planned. And we're really sad for that because he's getting ready to retire and he's a wealth of knowledge. But if we can't answer your questions today, we'll write them down and we'll get the answer from him and hopefully get you the information you need. I personally have sought him out to ask questions. When I first met him, I knew a couple things. So we're thrilled to have him. And so we're going to play a session that he did recently for some Master Gardeners. And please feel free to speak up and ask questions in the meantime. And also on the line is our extension agent. She's operating the live stream. Yes, ma'am.
Is he local? Is he in Roane County?
He's in Knoxville. He's a University of Tennessee professor. Right. And like I said, he's been there for decades and is truly an expert. One of the things I've enjoyed is he does his experiments, and one of his experiment location is up on the plateau. Do you guys know about the research station on the plateau? Near Crossville? So as you go toward Crossville, University of Tennessee has a research station there. And he's done a number of different studies. One of the things he did was on peaches and, they publish the results of their studies. And you can get those papers on the University of Tennessee website, the horticulture section, and very informative. If you have trouble finding that kind of information, let us know. And I probably can't help you, but I know who can. I do okay with stuff like that, but typically I rely on Jessica, who is our extension agent. So with that said, I'm going to start playing the program. Oh, I forgot to say one thing. Next month is Tennessee Smart Yards. And this is a program that's helping us learn how to be better stewards of our property and deal with the challenges that we have in our landscapes. So it's going to be taught by the people that run the program at the university. So, okay. All right. So we're going to do that. And Jessica, if you'll start the program, we'd appreciate it. And we can't hear anything again.
Variety of that same type of nut crop. And that variety needs to have viable pollen, and it needs to be discharged the pollen at the time
Can you
that
guys
the
hear?
female flowers are receptive. And that gets to be a little bit more difficult in Tennessee than in other parts of the world where a given type of nut is grown more commonly. If you want to grow nut trees for the nuts, then by all means, you need to be purchasing grafted trees. A seedling pecan, for example, there's no telling what it's going to be like. They don't come true to type, and therefore it's quite possible and quite probable that once a seedling tree starts to bear nuts, those nuts will not look like the parent tree where that nut was harvested. Another reason to buy grafted nut trees is that just the act of grafting can cut the time it takes to get a nut tree into production by 50% or more. One of the problems that I've had, and I consistently have it, and it's getting worse, is trying to find the grafted nut trees. Where would you go for them? It's the best source that we had used to be Nolan River Nut Tree Nursery in Kentucky. John Strang, the fruit specialist up there, told me that the man that had that passed away. Nobody has taken over the nursery. So what was our best source is no longer there. It's harder to find. And what we've also seen consistently over quite a few years is that the demand for the varieties and types of nut trees that we want to plant in Tennessee is high enough that you may have to actually order a year or two in advance to get the type of trees that you want. With that being said, we'll talk about some specific types of nut crops. Start off with walnut. The English walnut that you see advertised is actually a Carpathian walnut selection that supposedly has superior cold hardiness. And then there are varieties of that Carpathian, and you can see them listed here: the Allegheny, Bedco #1, Carpathian, Henry Kaiser, etc. These are again supposed to be more cold hardy than an English walnut. I will say that I have not seen a lot of them in Tennessee. Most of what I've seen have been in West Tennessee, and I've never seen one of the trees that did not have cold injury. So I wish that was not the case, because the nuts that they produce are like what I've always seen for English walnut. The size of the nut, the crack out, the nut fill is good. The quality is good, but the trees, because of the cold damage, tend to be relatively short-lived. Black walnut, on the other hand, are more adapted to our area. Now, if you're growing, especially if you want to grow black walnut for timber, and you want to get the best tree growth, you want to grow in river bottom type of site. So you've got a good, deep, fertile soil that's got good water holding capacity. But like I said, if you want to grow for timber, you're compromising the nut production, because in timber production, you plant the trees quite close together so that you get a nice straight trunk, and that means that you're going to reduce your fruiting potential because of the shade. There are varieties out there, and you can see it: Thomas, Stabler, a couple of examples of grafted black walnut. And again, you want to use grafted trees if you're growing for nut production. One of the unique things about black walnut is that the roots and some of the other tissues in the plant, like the shuck and the nut, produce a compound called juglones, which is toxic to a lot of other plant types. In fact, it's toxic to walnut. You very seldom will see a black walnut tree growing under a black walnut tree. They don't survive well. And I know apple trees won't. A lot of other types of plants will not survive. So black walnut, because of the juglones, can be a problem as far as what can be grown around it. And swing over into other, about the Chinese chestnut. You know, the American chestnut, of course, used to be the standard tree in a good bit of East Tennessee, and we lost those with the chestnut blight. We are growing Chinese chestnut for nut production, although not much of it is being done. The Chinese chestnut tree is marginally susceptible to chestnut blight. It will get the blight, but what I've seen it is that it would be on a limb that's perhaps a lower limb that's shaded from above. It's relatively weak, and that blight may damage that limb, but it's not going to take off the tree like it did with American chestnut. There is a problem with chestnut weevil, which is a worm that gets in the nut. It'll be the #1 pest problem. And we'll pick up nuts that will have a hole in them. That's the exit hole where the weevil has come out. And over time, populations of weevil build because they overwinter in the soil underneath the tree, and the percentage of infested nuts is going to go up and up. We've had some orchards that were out there that eventually quit selling nuts because the percentage of infested nuts was so high that they could no longer economically justify trying to harvest the crop. Control of the weevil is not that hard, but at the time the people were not willing to do it. And the chemicals that we use for weevil control have changed a lot over the last few years. There are varieties that we look at. You can see several listed here: Crane, Eaton, Oran, Nanking, Sleeping Giant. We could grow some pretty nice Chinese chestnuts. Now, over the years, there's been some work with hybrid trees, with Chinese and American, trying to get back to closer to what the American chestnut used to be. Most of the early hybrids were nothing special. They actually resembled the Chinese chestnut quite a bit. But within the last 3 years or so, the hope for having an American chestnut has really gotten better because they've identified the single gene that was responsible for chestnut blight, and they're able to take it out. And so chestnut, or development of a variety, especially in a nut tree, is a long-term process, but the hope for having American chestnut is better now than what it has been. So if we look at chestnuts in general, and this slide is a little out of order, I apologize, but we've got the American chestnut. Again, the nuts tend to be small and sweet, and this is the tree that comprised a lot of what we had in the mountains, highly susceptible to chestnut blight. The European chestnut is also blight susceptible. The nuts are not as good. They tend to be a little bit on the bitter side. Chinese chestnut, like I just talked about, highly resistant to blight. The trees tend to be low and spreading, not at all like the American chestnut tree, but the nuts are size, they're sweet, they're relatively easy to peel. They're a crop that actually has some potential in Tennessee, because almost all the chestnuts sold in Tennessee and other states are imported from other countries, Italy being one of the primary ones. Japanese chestnut gives us a small spreading blight resistant tree, but unfortunately the nuts are pretty poor quality, so they're not very popular. And then a chinkapin is actually chestnut that have small sweet fruits, but you're not seeing much of any call for that in the commercial area. I already talked about the hybrids, varieties that may be resistant to chestnut blight and hopefully would have the large sweet nuts. They're not here yet, but they're hopefully this is something to look forward to down the road. Focus back a little bit on the black walnut that is more common. We actually had a fair demand for it because of the timber value. It gives high value hardwood lumber, and the nuts are quite flavorful, although they're hard to hull and to shell. There was a processor out of Missouri, I think it was, that had buying stations across Tennessee, may still have, I don't know, but the prices they paid were pretty low, and people were reluctant to spend the time picking them up for what they could get back. As I said earlier, good nut production and good wood production are not on the same page. You do one or the other. It may take a long time. Here we say up to 80 years to produce a high quality timber or veneer. You can get a tree into fruit production much quicker than that. But again, you're not going to get the high quality out of that tree. Hazelnuts are also called filberts, is the same thing, and they're actually native to the eastern half of North America. Two factors that kind of limit hazelnut production. One of them is that we have a disease called eastern filbert blight that will kill trees. And so if we plant hazelnuts, there are resistant varieties out there, and that's what we need to select. Now, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on who you talk to, eastern filbert blight is also present out west. And when that happened, then the breeders in the west, and primarily out in Oregon, who started looking at resistance to eastern filbert blight and have developed some varieties that are resistant. Some filberts don't have the cold hardiness they need to satisfy or to perform well out in our part of the world, but others do. What we do see, unfortunately, is that the catkins or the male part of the variety of the bloom may shed pollen too early and not be a good pollinator for the female. And so we're looking at pollination characteristics to try to find varieties to recommend. If we look at this picture shows the catkin or the male part of the flower. And on many nut trees, the male or the catkin is separated from the female part of the flower on the tree. The catkins actually in some nut crops form during the summer of the year before they shed the pollen, whereas the female flower tends to come on the terminal of the current season's growth. So finding a variety that sheds its pollen at the time that the females are receptive to pollination can be a challenge. But hazelnut trees can be grown here. They can be grown as a bush or a tree. If it's a bush, look for something that may get upwards of 8 to 12 feet in height and about that wide. If it's a tree, they get to be taller, but here we say 14 to 16 feet. They'll get into production fairly early, about the 4th year. And actually, I had some at my house, and they actually produced some nuts the 3rd year. Bad thing about it was by the 4th year, the squirrels figured out what they were, and I never got any more nuts after that. Hazelnut, contrary to the other types of nut trees that we've covered so far, don't need to be grafted. They'll grow well on their own roots, and the trees or the shrubs will propagate themselves from root suckers. So you can dig up a root sucker and transplant it and increase the size of the planting if you want to do that. Ideal soil pH for most nuts, like we see with the hazelnut, is a pH of about 6.5. The trees tend to be relatively long life, and hazelnut is the shorter lives of most of the nut trees. And here it's 30 to 40 years or so. We can propagate trees by layering or by root suckers. You can see two problems in this slide. Lower left-hand side shows a branch being killed back by the eastern filbert blight, and it'll progress back in and take out eventually a major part of the tree. The other part, we see a disease up on the wood that those lesions will eventually kill that limb. So they're not without problems, but they're not that difficult to grow. Need 2 or more varieties for cross-pollination, and we need varieties that are resistant to eastern filbert blight. Okay, pecans I get more questions about pecan than any other nut crop in Tennessee, and we've got more options, okay? If you look at pecan, the major pecan producing areas are South Georgia, Southern Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, but we can grow them here, we can grow them further north. And in fact, if you look at the name of pecan, Carya illinoisensis, which suggests that they are adaptable to much further north than us. The varieties that we see in parts of Tennessee that we recommend are the northern varieties, and this chart lists them: Mandan, Green River, Posey, Major, Yates, are some that we look at. We need a variety of pecan that does not have to have a long growing season to mature the nuts. And that's a real issue here because, you know, if you look at Stewart pecan, for example, Stewart is quite common further south. And we say, well, we need 180 to 208 day period to mature the nut, a frost-free period. Well, it's not quite that easy. We need that period from bloom to nut maturity. Pecans don't bloom until like up in June. They're about the last thing to bloom. So we cannot go with the more common southern varieties and expect to mature the crop. And therefore, we're looking at shorter season varieties like these northern varieties of pecans. There's some new ones out now that have not been assessed as thoroughly as what I wish they were in the northern areas. But things like Lakota, Kansas, Nakano, or Ocoee are pretty good. One thing we focus on, if you want to plant a pecan, always look at scab resistance as a primary criteria in variety selection. Pecan scab is probably the #1 disease problem because the trees are susceptible all summer long. And of course, once they're established, the trees get so big you can't spray to control it. So resistance is what we're looking at. And on this chart, for example, Lakota shows very good scab resistance, whereas Caddo is susceptible. A good reason not to plant Caddo would be because of scab. Other things we're looking at is how big are the nuts. The fewer nuts per pound, of course, the bigger the nut. What percent kernel do you have? A high percent crack out, like Mandan has 62% kernel. That's quite desirable. We'd look at that too. These are the criteria that we'd use in trying to select varieties to plant in different parts of the state. Next slide shows some even newer varieties that are coming down the road. Bird, for example, has a very, very large nut, 47 nuts per pound, as opposed to Eclipse, it's got 61. 59% kernel, which is good. The negative part about Bird is it appears to be scab susceptible, and therefore not going to be necessarily one that we'd want to look at. With these new varieties, what we're seeing is on grafted trees, pecans are producing earlier in their life than ever before. And we're seeing some exciting things. This is Bird, and like I just showed you, it's a big nut and a high fill. And so, you know, what we're also seeing is that it'll fruit quite early. This particular slide was taken on a 3-year-old tree. And normally we're looking at 6 to 8 years before we start to see production. So newer varieties are more precocious. They fruit earlier in their life. And also we're actually seeing a variety, this one named Tom, is showing some dwarfing characteristic in the tree. You know, wouldn't that be neat to have a smaller pecan tree, one that would grow in a more confined area and make it easier to take because of the size of the tree. So some things are happening, some new varieties are coming along that may offer some exciting options to growers, commercial and home growers. We look at pollination as a critical thing. We need to have multiple varieties. I took this picture out of Texas Pecan Nursery's catalog, and basically what it shows is the bloom time on given varieties. And we talk about protandrous and protogynous varieties. Protandrous varieties is indicated by the red lines. Those are varieties where the pollen is shed by the catkin before the female flower is receptive to pollination. Whereas protogynous varieties, the female flower is receptive before that variety sheds pollen. So we need to look at having varieties that overlap pollen shed time and female receptivity to increase cropping consistency. Again, on this is pecan, but it shows the catkins which were formed the year before they actually shed the pollen. But it also shows a diagram of the female flower, which is a terminal bud on the current season's elongation. We've already talked about this, so we're not going to spend any more time on it. Another crop that I'm starting to get a few inquiries about is mulberry. Mulberry is a tree that's relatively easy to grow. It fruits early in its life, and the fruit has got a lot of advantages from a health standpoint. It tends to be very rich in antioxidants and vitamin C and iron, as well as being relatively low in calories. There are white mulberries and black mulberries trees out there that are native to China. And actually a red mulberry is native to America. I don't know of many of these trees around, but I did work with a grower in Gibson County that had one on his farm. It was black mulberry. It seemed to hit every year with a crop. They're a pretty interesting fruit. So like I said, we're getting more information or more inquiries about them. They are something that we need to accumulate some more data to give better answers to the questions that we're getting. Persimmons, we can grow persimmons all across Tennessee. There are both American persimmons and Asian persimmons, and there are some big differences. We'll talk a little bit about those. The American persimmon is smaller than the Asian persimmon, and you can see the differences in fruit size in the picture. The small American tend to be about the size of a plum, whereas the Asian persimmons are bigger, more along the size of a peach. Normally, when we think about persimmons, we think about astringent fruit. That is a fruit that cannot be eaten until it's fully ripe and soft. And that can be that's the case with the Americans, and it is the case on some of the Asian persimmons. But when the fruit is eaten soft, the flavors, they tend to be fairly sweet and kind of have some notes of honey. The non-astringent varieties, which would be some of the Asian persimmons, can be eaten like an apple. That is, when they're still relatively firm, they'll still be sweet, and they won't have the astringency that's been associated with a firm American persimmon. So the khaki is another name that you'll see persimmons referred to as. But we grow a fair amount of persimmons in the West Coast. California is number one. Florida is number two. Southeastern Texas has got a small industry. In West Tennessee, the Asian persimmon, also called Chinese or Japanese persimmon, can be grown fairly successfully. Carol Reese is probably, well, she's a much better resource about information on that than what I am. As you get into the eastern part of the state, then the Asian persimmons are not going to perform as consistently. And we see more of a focus on the American persimmon. Varieties of the Oriental or Asian or Japanese persimmon, the non-astringent ones, Giant Fuyu is probably one of the most common one. Hero is another one. On the astringent type, then you've got a whole bunch of them. Realize that there are both out there for the Oriental persimmon crop. The American persimmon, which is native to the eastern part of North America, it exists all the way from Connecticut down to South Florida and over to central Illinois, Iowa. And we definitely can grow them here, but they tend to be astringent. The thought that you had to have a hard frost before they became edible is not actually correct. They need to be fully ripe. Now, the two scenarios tend to fall about the same time, so that kind of reinforces the frost belief on them. But the American persimmon is more cold tolerant than the Oriental. The trees tend to be fairly vigorous when young, and quite often will graft an Oriental persimmon onto an American persimmon to get the tree off to a better growth. Trees can get fairly big, here to say about 50 feet in height. They do need well-drained sites and full sun, like most other fruit crops. Here you can see two Oriental persimmons and just a difference in the tree shape. On the left, more of an apple tree, central leader type of shape, whereas on the right, the Fuyu is more open, like a peach tree, more open center. Astringency, we talked about a good bit about that, but I guess it should be mentioned because if you get a hold of an astringent variety, it's not a pleasant experience. They do need to be completely ripe, really soft before they're palatable. All American persimmon varieties are astringent. On the Oriental persimmon range, there are non-astringent varieties that can be ripe when they're firm. They can be eaten like an apple, or they can be allowed to soften and eaten at that time. What do we use persimmons for? Of course, fresh consumption. They are something that's used for salads, for color or flavor, and they can be made into a custard or a soft ice cream as well. And they're used in baking goods as well. So few natural pests. So it is a crop that maybe could be grown without a whole lot of pesticide inputs. Trees tend to be drought tolerant, but realize that irrigation, you'll get better production, better sized fruit, more consistent cropping. Persimmon trees tend to have a relatively low chilling requirement, which is probably one reason, especially with the Orientals, that you don't see them grown throughout much of the state of Tennessee. Okay. Pawpaw is another crop that's native to our area, and we see an increased interest in pawpaw. Pawpaw is referred to in some areas as a poor man's banana. And here you can see the tree on the right side, the fruit on top, and then a cut open fruit on the bottom. Notice the large seeds, the color of the flesh, as well as the color of the skin on pawpaw. Like I said, poor man's banana, another name for pawpaw. The only near relatives for pawpaw are tropical fruits. They look like mangoes, they taste like banana, but in And actually, pawpaws are native to most of the eastern part of the US and all the way up into Canada. Tend to be hardy, relatively pest-free, and especially young pawpaw trees will grow in shade, not a heavy shade, but will grow in a partial light shade to partial shade. A full size or more mature tree likes higher levels of sunlight. Kentucky State University, not the University of Kentucky, but Kentucky State University is a repository for pawpaws, and they've actually released several varieties, and they've got a lot of information about pawpaw production. They do have a breeding program on pawpaws, looking at developing varieties with yellow to orange flesh, big fruit size, small seeds, uniform fruit shape, and one that are not as prone to external blemishes. The flesh, we're trying to get a sweeter flesh, and some pawpaws, especially some of the seedling varieties, tend to have a relatively unpleasant aftertaste, and they're trying to breed varieties that will not have that. So pawpaw is a crop that can be grown, and it's a relatively unique crop for us. In markets, they're bringing a pretty high price, premium price, because they're relatively rare on the market. Interestingly, the flowers on pawpaws tend to have a disagreeable smell, and flies and beetles tend to be the main pollinizers, not bees. Pawpaws, when they're fully ripe, don't transport well at all. That's a limitation, of course, if you're going to be marketing them. There are varieties that were developed in Kentucky. KSU Atwood, KSU Benson are two examples of those. Some seedling pawpaws will do very well. Others are not. So the fruit itself resembles a banana, greenish yellow skin, however, can become, well, like a banana, can become speckled or streaked with brown when it's ripe. The fruit size varies a lot, and the flesh quite often is creamy white with kind of a custard-like consistency, similar to banana, but you might find pineapple or mango in there as far as the flavors. The seeds are fairly easy to separate. They tend to be large. Ripening time on pawpaw, late summer to early fall. If you want to propagate a pawpaw tree from seed, realize that they, like many of our crops, need to be stratified. That is, exposed to a cold, moist environment for a period of time before the seed will germinate. pH 5 to 7, again, get it up above 6 before you plant. Young plants prefer shade. As they get older, they'll tolerate higher levels of sunlight, and they can grow decent crops in partial shade. If you get too much shade, then fruiting falls off. Generally, about the 5th year, they'll start to fruit, and fruiting will vary depending on tree vigor. Harvest the fruit when it's fully ripe or just beginning to soften. And pawpaws don't respond well to cooking, so fresh eating is pretty much the way they're used. Varieties that are out there, early ripening, like Fairchild and Ketter, and then later varieties. Several of those, and then I listed those out of Kentucky State earlier on. And Natalie, you mentioned pomegranate earlier on. Pomegranate is described as being a dense, deciduous, bushy, multi-stem shrub. It is trained as a tree in some areas, and it can get upwards of 10 to 12 feet in height. The branches quite often are thorny, so it's not a fun tree to work with glossy dark green leaves, and the fruit can be quite highly colored and a lot of juicy seeds inside. I don't see much pomegranate grown in Tennessee. They're they're a little bit more sensitive to weather conditions. But if you look at the fruit, the flowers tend to be orange, red color and come out in spring or summer. So frost is not a major issue with them. Quite often the flower shape will tell you whether it's a female plant or what type. And this just talks about the bell shape being female and vase shaped, a hermaphroditic or sterile flower. The edible portion of the fruit is called the aril, A-R-I-L. And you can see the picture where the seed surrounded by juicy pigments and juice around that seed. The seed can be either hard or soft. And the juice will vary from light pink to dark red, or maybe even be yellow or almost clear. So we grow them a lot for the juice, or we use them for the juice. With the rind, usually smooth and leathery, and I really don't know about use rind on pomegranate. But they tend to be self-fruitful. Insects and hummingbirds are pollination vectors, so they'll move the pollen around. Blooming is relatively late on up in here, it says April to June. And earlier blooms give you larger fruit, which I would expect. And already mentioned the flowers can be either sterile, hermaphroditic, or female, or you can have male non-fruit bearing flowers as well. Pomegranates are supposedly hardy down to about 12 degrees Fahrenheit. And there are some varieties where they'll claim even a little bit more hardiness, but that's going to limit their growth in Tennessee a good bit. They tend to be quite heat tolerant and like our hot summers. And so from that standpoint, they'll do fairly well. Our main limitation is going to be winter weather conditions. Get production 5 to 6 years of tree life. Soils, just like others, deep loamy soils are best. They'll grow better. They'll grow well in some of our sandy clay soils if we've got adequate rooting depth and well-drained soils. pHs upper 5s to 6. Pomegranate actually do grow in a 7+ soil pH, but well-drained soils are essential. Full sun, 6 hours a day or more, and good air drainage for frost and disease protection. Figs, mentioned briefly earlier, but the varieties of figs that you'll find in the East are primarily Brown Turkey, Celeste, and Chicago Hardy. The fruit is small on them. That which is objectionable to some people, especially Brown Turkey, but they can be quite sweet. The winter protection is important to get that spring crop, which we call the Breba crop. Quite often we lose the plant to the ground and lose that spring crop. If we have a late enough fall, we can mature the fall crop. But the fall crop is primarily the biggest crop. And so it's the one that even if you don't get the spring crop, you can get pretty good yields if you get a fall that does allow the crop to ripen. Bare root plants, set them in spring, prune them back, just like we'd take care of other plants. Set them about the same depth, maybe a little bit deeper than they were in the nursery, water them well, and don't fertilize directly in the hole because you could burn the plant. Simple, same types of things we talk about with other types of plants. Figs can be grown to a bush form, and over time, if you don't have cold injury, you're going to have to do some thinning. I was talking to a person earlier it was last week, who needs to thin out that bush because it's getting so crowded that they don't get yields consistently throughout the crown of the plant. Pruning can be done to thin out the plants. I like to wait late enough in the winter or up in spring to prune that will allow me to identify how much cold injury we may have had on the plant, because we may have to cut some shoots clear back to the ground, or others can be headed back to healthy wood. Fertilizing, and again, like other fruit crops, figs have a relatively modest fertility requirement, and depends a little bit on your soils as to how much fertilizer you may or may not need to use. But wait until growth is actually started before we fertilize, because especially with nitrogen, if we fertilize too early, you're not going to benefit from the nitrogen. Split application may be worthwhile, where you go very conservative on the rates early on, see how the plant is growing, what the crop is like, and then you could bump the fertilizer a little bit further in the growing season if necessary. As far as figs go, they get best when you allow them to ripen on the plant, but don't let them stay on the plant too long. Spotted winged Drosophila likes figs, and so they can be an issue. Harvest the fig when the neck of the fig tends to wilt and the fruit droops down. Fresh tree ripened figs have the best flavor, of course. If you're going to preserve them, don't let them get quite as ripe, because they preserve better before that. If you're going to dry them, allow them to ripen on the plant, and then they'll kind of dry down, lose water by the time you harvest, and hopefully you can dry them without them rotting. Elderberries, we're seeing more interest in elderberry, and actually I put out a planting of elderberries about 40 years ago, elderberries and currants, to look at a low input crop for homeowners. Elderberries fill that bill. Now you can see them growing wild all over the place, but there are some varieties that we recommend. Johns and Adams are two varieties that have been around since the early 1900s and still good varieties for us. Here you can see the plant, the bush, the bloom, and the fruit. Elderberry will grow into a pretty large shrub. The white flowers are pretty, and actually they're using the flowers some too for ornamental purposes. The fruit is good for juice, for pies, for wines, jellies. Elderberry grows best on well-drained soils, pH of 6 to 6.5. And the Missouri State, I think it is, or the University of Missouri, it actually has an elderberry program now, and they've got a good publication online on elderberry production, and they've developed a couple varieties too. So that publication is called Growing and Marketing Elderberries in Missouri, and like I said, it's online, so you could access that. And this just shows the bloom and the fruit. Spotted winged Drosophila again likes elderberries, so be aware of that. Berries, currants used to be illegal to grow in a good bit of the eastern part of the country because they were an alternate host for white pine blister rust. That has changed, and it varies among state to state or county to county within states. It's legal to grow gooseberries and currants in Tennessee at this time. They're easier to grow further north than they are here, but they will grow in fruit. Gooseberries used for pies, jelly, for fresh fruit. Not a lot of pest issues with them. They're not real heat tolerant, but they tend to be quite winter hardy. The varieties that I used were those that are shown here: Clark, Fredonia, and Pixwell. They'll be a nice shrub. Be aware that they are thorned. And you can see the ripe gooseberries on the left. Currants, black, red, and white currants can be grown. And interestingly, black currants did not used to be considered to be an edible crop. They were looked at as a medicinal crop until relatively recently. But the health benefits of all of these, but especially the black currants, are getting to be more and more well known. We can grow them in Tennessee and make jelly or other products out of them. They are unique to crop. I mean, we just don't see a lot of them, but they will grow and do fairly well here. Jellies, syrups, pies, all of them. Black currants tend to be especially high in vitamin C. It's a crop that, you know, if you want something that's kind of different and unique, that may fill the bill. These are the varieties that I found when I looked at this a couple, 3 years ago. There are probably new ones out there now, but there are red, white, black, and even a pink variety that you can grow. So with that, currants, you want to harvest them after the fruit softens because they're not going to ripen off the plant, but get them before the fruit shrivels. I would suspect that the spotted wing Drosophila will be an issue with them, just like it would with the elderberry. But it's a good crop if you want something that's a little bit different to grow. Kiwi fruit, the hardy kiwis generally need about 150 frost-free days to grow. Used to be that we had male and female plants, but there also was a perfect flowered kiwi hardy kiwi out there too. But in the where the male and female plants existed, generally we were recommending planting about 1 male per 4 female plants. And the male plants tend to be less cold hardy than the female plants. And so if you lost the male plants, then chances are, of course, you're not going to get any fruit until you reestablish that other male plant. pH, like everything else we've talked about, ideally 6 or 6.5 to start. A trellis is good for the hardy kiwis because you want to get that fruit up off the ground. Makes it a lot easier, and of course a lot easier to get good clean fruit by not having them in contact with the soil. About to run out of time, so I'm going to slip along. It takes the kiwi 2 or 3 years to start to fruit. So, you know, if you put out a plant, it may well not give you anything back for the first few years it's in the ground. And that's not something to be concerned about. It could be normal. Okay, let's see. I think going to stop there. I'm about done. These just listed some of the varieties that are out there now. So with that, I'm done. Okay, I'll turn it
All
back.
right, Dr. Lockwood, thank you very much. So I have a couple of questions that I'll throw you in. We have to let Dave get off on time because he is actually gonna be on a meeting where we're all talking about blackberries. So to recap, Greg and I, when on our Friday Fruit Field Day, talked a lot about blueberries and blackberries, and then today Dr. Lockwood really talked about everything else. So together we've really covered a huge swath of fruit. But we had a really good question that was kind of asking about some of the propagation aspects. And I know that you mentioned, well, you might be able to start a few pawpaws from seeds, but I wondered if maybe you just wanted to hit on why we use
Do you guys want to listen to this Q&A or
I wouldn't mind.
let's see if we can't get I don't know if I have control over it or if she does.
asexual
We'll hit play
propagation
again.
for the huge percentage of our fruit crops and the fact that we don't really use seed all that much.
Yeah. Biggest reason is if you've got a plant that needs to be cross-pollinated and you try to propagate the plant from the seeds, you're going to get a lot of variation. And and I guess one of the best examples we got of that is we have a grower in Humphreys County, Dr. McClure, who lined out a bunch of peach seeds off one tree and grew them out to fruiting and got about 20 different, very different types of peaches. They ranged all the way from clingstone to freestone. There was a white flesh peach in there, ripened the end of May all the way up into August. And all this variation came off of seeds that were off the same tree. And it just shows that they don't come true to type. And so seedling propagation is a good way for the breeder maybe to look for selections that might have superior characteristics. But once they find a plant that has the characteristic they want, the way they propagate to keep it is through vegetative propagation. So if you graft onto say a pecan, if you graft a major pecan onto a pecan seedling, then when that variety gets up and starts to bear nuts, they will be identical to the parent. Whereas if you'd planted a bunch of major seedlings, none of them may actually look like the parent. So we grow from seed to get the variations, but once we find what we like, we maintain that characteristic through vegetative propagation. That
Yeah. That is that's great. And so I'll throw in a last kind of summary discussion. We talked about a whole range of fruit crops, and if you were to suggest for first-time beginner fruit growers the 2 or 3 simplest where to start first fruit crops, what would you say?
If I were gonna grow fruits and I was a beginner, right now I'd kind of look at blackberry as one of my first, because it's we know a lot about blackberry. It's relatively straightforward to grow. You can get fruit fast, and that's one of the things that we don't want to be discouraged sitting around waiting for this new plant to start to grow. So blackberry will come in quickly. Strawberries will come in fairly quickly. Especially with strawberry, the earlier harvest, we don't accumulate as many pest problems as we do with something that might mature later in the season. As we go along, blueberries are pretty good. If we do a good job getting the site ready, then there's not a lot of issues after that. But as you go into, say, the tree fruits, they become much more difficult. It's something I probably would suggest getting a few years experience under your belt before you take on some of the tree fruits.
All right, that is a great place to summarize our fruit discussion. And I think we will say a sincere thank you to Dr. Lockwood for sharing his great experience and expertise with us today on the blackberry topic. We'll let him log off if he needs to jump on to a blackberry meeting.
All right, so very good. Thank you, Jessica. So,
Thank you for your indulgence